Imagine a world where the decisions made in distant boardrooms ripple outward to shape the lives of billions. A world where the prosperity of some nations rests on systems that entrench poverty elsewhere. This is not fiction, it's our reality. From the sweeping policies of international trade agreements to the fine print of intellectual property laws, the global order is anything but neutral. Instead, it operates as a complex web of institutional frameworks that often prioritize the interests of the powerful, leaving the most vulnerable at its margins. Today we delve into the compelling insights of Thomas Pogge, a philosopher who challenges us to look beyond borders and re-examine the systems we take for granted. Pogge's work shines a light on the hidden structures that perpetuate inequality, compel migration, and obstruct global justice. Through his lens, migration isn't just a story of individual journeys. It's a mirror reflecting systemic injustices, exposing how the global North's affluence is tightly interwoven with the global South's struggles. We'll explore three core dynamics at the heart of Pogge's critique: how institutional frameworks fuel inequality and drive migration, the moral obligations of wealthy nations to confront these injustices, and the inextricable link between poverty, oppression, and global justice. Along the way, we'll examine real-world examples, trade agreements that displace millions, climate change policies that deepen inequality, and the enduring legacies of colonialism that shape migration flows today. At its heart, this talk is about accountability. Pogge invites us to consider a simple yet profound question. What does it mean to live ethically in a world so interconnected yet so unequal? By unpacking his ideas, we hope to inspire a deeper understanding of the forces that shape global migration and spark meaningful conversations about the path to a more just world. Let's start with the foundation of Pogge's critique: the interconnected forces of institutional frameworks, inequality, and migration. Pogge's analysis challenges us to see beyond individual choices and circumstances, asking us to examine how global systems shape economic realities and, by extension, the flow of human lives across borders. At the core of Pogge's argument is the idea that global institutional arrangements like trade agreements, intellectual property laws, and financial policies are designed in ways that systematically benefit wealthier nations. These frameworks create and reinforce economic inequalities by ensuring that wealth and resources flow in one direction, toward the already powerful. For instance, consider the TRIPS agreement under the World Trade Organization. By enforcing stringent intellectual property protections, TRIPS disproportionately benefits pharmaceutical companies in wealthy countries. The result? Life-saving medications are priced out of reach for millions in poorer nations. This dynamic doesn't just perpetuate economic disparities, it also directly impacts health, education, and opportunities, deepening the cycle of poverty. Another example lies in structural adjustment programs implemented by institutions like the IMF and World Bank. In exchange for financial aid, these programs required developing nations to cut public spending on essential services like healthcare and education. The long-term consequence? Entire generations in these countries were left without the tools to break free from systemic poverty. Now let's follow this thread to migration. Economic inequality doesn't just trap people in poverty, it pushes them to seek opportunities elsewhere. Pogge's work resonates with what migration theorists call push-pull dynamics. Poverty, unemployment, and lack of access to basic services act as push factors, driving people out of their home countries. Meanwhile, the promise of better livelihoods, education, and safety in wealthier nations acts as a powerful pull. A striking example is the displacement of rural farmers in Mexico following the implementation of NAFTA. Subsidized U.S. agricultural products flooded the Mexican market, driving local farmers out of business. With no other means of livelihood, many migrated north seeking work and stability. This isn't a story of individual failure. It's a systemic outcome of trade policies that prioritize profit over people. Another layer to this inequality is climate change. Countries like Bangladesh, which contribute the least to global emissions, bear the brunt of its effects: rising sea levels, crop failures, and natural disasters. For many, migration becomes the only option for survival, not opportunity. Finally, we arrive at the direct link between institutional structures and migration. Pogge points out that global systems are designed to favor the mobility of capital. Corporations can move across borders with ease, but restrict the mobility of labor. This creates a paradox. The systems that displace people economically are the same systems that prevent them from seeking solutions. Consider the EU's common agricultural policy. By heavily subsidizing European farmers, it enables them to undercut local producers in African markets. This economic dislocation forces many in countries like Senegal and Mali to migrate toward Europe. Yet once they reach Europe, these migrants face significant barriers, from restrictive visa policies to rising anti-immigrant sentiment. The very systems that create migration pressures are designed to make migration a last resort. What Pogge reveals through these examples is the inescapable interconnectedness of inequality and migration. It's easy to frame migration as an issue of individual choice, but when we zoom out, we see that these choices are shaped and often constrained by global systems that perpetuate inequality. Migration is not just a consequence of inequality, it's a symptom of a global order that prioritizes profit over fairness and capital over human dignity. If we truly want to address migration, Pogge argues, we must start by reforming these institutional frameworks. Redistribution mechanisms like his global resource dividend, which taxes wealth derived from global resource exploitation, could help level the playing field. But at the heart of this issue is a question of justice. Can we design global systems that prioritize human well-being over national interests? Having established the systemic roots of inequality and migration, let's now turn to the role of wealthy nations. Pogge's critique centers on a provocative but inescapable question. What moral obligations do the world's richest nations bear in perpetuating and ultimately reforming these global injustices? Pogge challenges us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The prosperity of wealthy nations is not simply a matter of hard work or innovation. It is inextricably tied to systems that disadvantage the global poor. From centuries of colonial exploitation to modern trade policies, the wealth of the global North has been built on the labor, resources, and sacrifices of the global South. This, Pogge argues, creates a moral obligation. His argument aligns with the principle of luck egalitarianism, which asserts that morally arbitrary advantages, like being born in a wealthy nation, impose responsibilities to ensure fairness. Pogge critiques wealthy nations for not only failing to rectify historical injustices, but also continuing to benefit from inequitable systems today. Take the colonial legacies in Africa. European powers extracted vast amounts of wealth, leaving nations impoverished and politically unstable. These effects linger, seen in cycles of conflict and economic dependency. Pogge argues that these historical harms impose a duty on former colonial powers to support reparative policies. This duty is not charity, it's justice. Acknowledging moral responsibility is not enough. Pogge insists that wealthy nations must act on these obligations by driving systemic change. This requires structural reforms that tackle root causes, not symptoms, of inequality and migration. His vision resonates with the capabilities approach developed by thinkers like Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, emphasizing the creation of equitable opportunities for human flourishing. A practical example is Norway's sovereign wealth fund. Norway invests its oil revenues into sustainable development projects worldwide, demonstrating a commitment to using its economic power to address global inequality. Another example is the Jubilee 2000 campaign, which successfully pressured wealthy nations to cancel the unpayable debts of poorer countries. These initiatives show that structural reform is both possible and transformative when driven by moral imperatives. Wealthy nations also wield disproportionate influence in global institutions like the WTO, IMF, and World Bank. Pogge critiques their failure to use this power for equitable reform, arguing that nations with the most resources and leverage bear the greatest responsibility to drive change. The Paris Climate Agreement offers a glimpse of this potential. In 2015, wealthy nations pledged financial and technological support to help developing countries mitigate and adapt to climate change. This reflects an acknowledgement, albeit limited, that those who contribute most to global problems must lead efforts to solve them. Similarly, Pogge Pogge's own global resource dividend proposal imagines a world where wealth generated from exploiting global resources is redistributed to address inequality and migration pressures. But Pogge's point is that these efforts are not nearly enough. Too often, wealthy nations use their power to entrench rather than reform the systems that sustain their dominance. Trade policies like the aforementioned TRIPS agreement are a stark reminder of this imbalance. So what can we take away from this analysis? Pogge challenges us to rethink the role of wealthy nations, not as distant observers of global inequality, but as active participants in its perpetuation and potential resolution. The idea that benefiting from injustice imposes a moral obligation to reform unjust systems is a powerful one, cutting through the noise of political rhetoric to demand real accountability. The road to reform isn't easy. Structural changes require wealthy nations to confront uncomfortable truths about their role in global inequality and to prioritize fairness over short-term national interests. But as Pogge reminds us, these reforms are not only necessary, they are our moral duty. As we turn to our final section, we'll explore how poverty and oppression perpetuate cycles of harm and why addressing these issues is essential for realizing global justice. The global migration crisis isn't a story of borders, it's a story of justice. It's a story about systems, economic, political, and environmental, that force millions to leave their homes, not out of choice but desperation. And it's a story about responsibility, ours. Thomas Pogge's work lays bare the truth we can no longer ignore. Wealthy nations, institutions, and individuals have not only benefited from these injustices but have perpetuated them. The time to act is now. If we want to address migration, we must go beyond short-term fixes. Building walls and enforcing borders doesn't solve the problem, it masks it. The real solution lies in dismantling the systems that create the inequality driving migration. That means reforming trade agreements that exploit the global south. It means holding institutions like the WTO, IMF, and World Bank accountable for policies that have impoverished nations for decades. And it means redistributing resources through mechanisms like Pogge's global resource dividend to ensure that every country has the tools to build a sustainable future. Imagine a world where farmers in Senegal aren't forced to migrate because European subsidies destroyed their livelihoods. Imagine a world where Bangladeshis can remain in their homes because we acted swiftly to mitigate climate change. These are not dreams, they are possibilities, if we commit to reforming the systems that have failed us. The prosperity of wealthy nations didn't emerge in a vacuum. It was built on centuries of colonialism, exploitation, and systemic inequality. Pogge's work makes clear that this history imposes an obligation. Those who have benefited must lead the way in creating a fairer world. This isn't charity, it's justice. Wealthy nations must open their borders, not close them. They must expand legal pathways for migration, provide reparative funding to historically exploited nations, and lead on global challenges like climate adaptation and debt forgiveness. But this moral obligation isn't just for governments, it's for all of us. We must demand policies that align with justice, reject xenophobic narratives, and recognize migrants not as threats, but as human beings seeking dignity and opportunity. Migration is not the problem, inequality is. Every refugee who crosses a border, every family that flees poverty or violence, is a reminder that our global systems are failing. Pogge's insights compel us to address this failure at its source. That means investing in education, healthcare, and infrastructure in the global south. It means ensuring equitable access to resources like vaccines, food, and energy. And it means treating migration not as a crisis, but as a symptom of deeper injustices, ones that can and must be remedied. When we shift our focus to justice, everything changes. Migration becomes a choice, not a necessity. Nations thrive together, not at each other's expense, and the human dignity we so often claim to value becomes a reality for everyone, not just a privileged few. This is our moment. Immigration dilemmas are not insurmountable, they are opportunities. Opportunities to reimagine a world where borders don't define our responsibilities, where institutions serve people rather than profits, and where justice transcends geography. But this world won't build itself. It requires us, all of us, to act. Demand systemic reform, advocate for fair trade, fight for climate justice, support ethical policies that protect migrants and empower their home countries, reject the narratives that dehumanize and divide us, and most importantly, believe that a more just world is possible. Because without that belief, there can be no change. Pogge's vision is bold, but it is within our reach. The systems we've built were made by us, and they can be remade by us. The question isn't whether we have the power to act, it's whether we have the courage. Justice demands courage. The time for action is now.